Welcome to everyone. My name is Judy Schwartz, and I'm a journalist, author, and other things. We'll just kind of add to that list over time. And I live in Bennington, in nearby Bennington. And I've been an environmental author for 3 books worth, with about a decade's worth. I wrote 3 books in 8 years. And when I look back on that, I think kind of wow, because these weren't just books that you sit there and make stuff up. It involved going to Africa, going to Mexico, going to Norway, and sort of bumping into stories and getting obsessed about them and following up with them. So yeah, it was kind of a wild ride for several years. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a page and a half from the introduction, because this book starts right here, or it starts in Bennington, which I think is close enough. And then I'll share a little bit about the book, what I'm up to or what I was up to. And then I want to open it up for conversation, because the things that I'm going to be talking about are things that people feel pretty strongly about, such as climate change, such as what is happening to our Earth and what can be done about it. And there's a lot that can be done, and that's what gets me very excited about it. So I'm going to launch right in to the introduction of the Reindeer Chronicles and other inspiring stories of working with nature to heal the Earth. The biologist and pioneer of ecological design, John Todd, once wrote, "That which has been damaged can be healed." I remember when this notion became personal for me. It was an evening in early June, our first dinner on the deck. I looked down over the meadow, across overlapping layers of green, the flared crowns of trees, grasses flecked white with wild strawberry, and the garden where stalks of garlic rose from their mulchy beds, green all the way to the blackberry thicket at the bottom of the hill, a prickly moat guarding the forest. From the stillness, I heard our state bird, the hermit thrush. Its fluted call, heard only this time of year, always evokes for me the possibility of earthly perfection, joy captured in sound. Southern Vermont puts on a good show in late spring. Still, thanks to what I understood from writing about soil and land health, I knew our small acreage could be more lush and productive. Our old apple trees, like most 19th century Vermonters, the farmers who once lived here grew apples for cider, are being crowded out by brush. The hillside slope is overgrown. And after migrating tentatively year after year, the black raspberry vines have largely disappeared, as have the thimbleberries. You know those? The thimble-shaped red berries sit on your tongue and dissolve into pith. People often ask me what they can do personally to help the environment, and I always say to start where they are. My husband, Tony, and I have mostly managed the land through benign neglect. Now I wondered which plants and in what numbers would help the land be vibrant and sustain diversity. What would peak backyard look like? I mentally conjured up photographs of restoration projects I've followed, food forests dripping with fruit, fields of thigh-high flowers, and superimposed them over the modest scene in front of me. As the sun slipped behind the far mountain, the sky darkened another hue, a hard green at the edge of gray. The hermit thrush trilled a melody and stopped at a high treble pitch, leaving a musical void. Over the last several years, I've observed people reviving landscapes through holistic planned grazing on farms and ranches in Vermont, the Great Plains, and Mexico, that are verdant and full of birds and butterflies, while conventionally managed land nearby languishes. Here, I could bring in sheep to replace the lawnmower and manage brush. I could put in more plants to attract pollinators. In rainy Vermont, where it never dries out, it's easy for land to be just okay, but enhanced ecology on every scale matters. As Jeff Lawton, the permaculture designer who famously created a food forest in the Jordanian desert, says, all the world's problems can be solved in a garden. As a journalist, I look for and get excited by what's missing from the conversation, and specifically in journalism, what isn't being written about. And so about, I guess it's a decade ago or even 11 years ago, I was struck that what was missing from the climate conversation was soil. The role of soil in cycling carbon, holding carbon, and in addressing many other challenges, specifically water challenges and biodiversity challenges. So I wrote a book about soil. Then, what I felt was missing, so this was during the California drought. It actually made me crazy that when people were talking about water, it was always about what does or doesn't come down from the sky. But having written a book about soil, I knew that what you do with the land has everything to do with whether you have water or not, and whether you can be resilient in the face of drought or floods. So, and also when we talked about, when the connection between is made between water and climate, it always went in one direction, which was how climate change will put added stress on water resources throughout the world, which of course is a huge, huge matter. But what was missing was the role that water plays in climate, and an understanding that water regulates climate. I mean, you know, like that is how it works. So, or as one source of mine says, what does he say? 95% of the heat dynamics of the blue planet, he always says the blue planet, is determined by the water cycle. And then I still felt that there was a lot that was missing from our policy conversations, our consternation about where to go, how do we deal with our very large looming problems. And what was still missing from the climate conversation was the role of healthy ecosystems in climate regulation, because through my reporting, I knew that we can restore even large-scale damaged ecosystems. So therefore, we can restore at least some of that climate regulating capacity. So I felt compelled to tell the stories of what I saw as a growing global movement celebrating and encouraging ecosystem restoration. So I can share stories around the world from from here and there. I can talk about what we can do here, what I see happening here in Vermont. I can go lots and lots of different places. I can even talk, how about if I start with what has come up for me in my world in the last 24 hours? Yes. I will just do that. So it's really interesting that sometimes what determines whether people, the importance of a title, the importance of an attractive, compelling brand or name. So let me see if any of you have heard of this. Have any of you heard of something called farmer managed natural regeneration? See? It's a mouthful. Okay, what I'm very excited about is that more and more people globally are understanding that this is a tremendous way of restoring some of the harshest landscapes throughout the world. So I will tell you the story of Tony Ronaldo, who I've written about him in other books, and have been in conversation with him, including last night. So when I say, the last 24 hours, yes. Okay, so Tony Ronaldo is an Australian, and early in his career, he was doing missionary work, specifically in Niger, which is a very dry, extremely impoverished country in Western Africa at the edge of the Sahara, where nothing was growing. And he wanted to help people there deal with their lack of food and their lack of hope for the future. So he spent several months there, and he was getting increasingly despairing. He said, okay, I can talk about religion, I can share my compassion, I can talk about hope, but these people don't really want to hear that. What they want is solutions to their perpetual impoverishment, lack of food, lack of water, and lack of capacity to farm even the most basic of crops. So he was in this state of, I just don't know how long I can stay here and do this work, when he had to get out of the car to let air out of the tires, because in the desert, when all you have is sand, you need to let air out of the tires in order to get a grip to be able to move. So he, was going around outside of the side of the car, and he saw something. He saw some kind of scraggly vegetation, and he went over to it, and he looked carefully, and he thought, oh, some shrub, but this must be, it doesn't seem to be producing anything. But he looked a little bit more closely at it, and he saw from the leaves that this was a tree. So what it was sprouting from trees that had been cut, because these people were cutting trees for firewood to sell so that they had some money to buy food and all of this. And he said, oh my gosh, this is a tree trying to resprout. And he looked around, and he saw all over were these little truncated treelets. And he thought many things. First of all, he realized that these trees were growing, they were kind of creating themselves, they were coming back from what was going on underground. And he understood that there was this whole underground forest. Then he thought, well, hey, if we just let these stumps be, well, they'll grow some vegetation, and then the goats will come over, and the goats will eat that, and eventually nothing will grow. How about if we protect these stumps and encourage them and see what happens? So from that simple insight, like across Niger into Malawi, and in talking to him when he was telling the story yesterday to a group of colleagues, he said that this was all farmer to farmer. It wasn't that he stood up and said, okay, I'm putting down my flag and I figured this out. No, he understood after he started exploring that this was based on indigenous practices. But because these people were so impoverished, the management of these stumps was prohibitive for them. So this was an indigenous practice that he came to build on and work on it, and it spread farmer to farmer. And so they're all over the country and beyond, there are trees growing. Now, not forests like we have here in Vermont, because that's not the kind of landscape, more on farmland, that there would be, like in Savannah, you have grasslands and the occasional tree. So it's more trees integrated into the farming areas and the land that the people are inhabiting. And we often think that the only trees that matter are trees and forests, but that's not true at all. I mean, this provides shade, shade for people, shade for livestock, shade for plants that are growing. You know, intermittent shade is really powerful for allowing seedlings to get, you know, to get a start. And I know that the World Resources Institute has been very excited about this work for a long time. And they have been now doing a lot of monitoring work about trees where we aren't looking for trees and getting insight into that. So that is one thing. Oh, and the other thing is that he has a new book out called, I think, The Forest Unseen or something like that. So that's available. So Tony, who's a very quiet, humble man, is realizing that, you know, he's also in his 70s. It's time for him to tell his story. So what else came up in the last 24 hours? So I have a lot of colleagues in the Southwest, which is experiencing, yes?
Before you go on to another story, since it was an indigenous practice, and since they were too poor and desperate to maintain it, what made a difference?
You know, I haven't asked him that question. It could be that the support that his organization and others could offer would create the conditions for them to be able to do that work on their own or to support them. I'm not sure exactly which.
It seems to me that so often we know, or the indigenous population knows, what should be done, but they cannot do it without, usually, financial aid. And so the question is not the person who tells the story about the interaction and environment, but the connections that make it possible for it to happen, that are ecological, except social, political, ecological.
Right. Exactly. That it is really important to understand context and to understand that what we term environmental problems are, you know, we can also look through the lens of people, social, economic, and political challenges. Yeah, I don't know if that's where you were going.
Well, where I'm going is a lot of frustration, all right, which is we have a phenomenal amount of knowledge, and other people who have lived on the land have a phenomenal amount of knowledge as to how to do it right, and they can't. Because they, you know, of the larger economic, you know,
right.
milieu.
Right. One point that I make in this book that a filmmaker named John Liu has kind of highlighted in his work is that many people around the world are put in a situation where the only way that they can be part of the global economy and therefore sustain themselves is by undermining the ecological conditions upon which they depend. It's huge.
So my pinpointing, and then I'll shut up. Okay, my pinpointing is that it seems that a lot of people who have, let's say, like the fellow who made this discovery, okay, they have the environmental knowledge, but they also have contacts that bring in what is such minimal aid by our standards to make the difference. And, you know, so often that is not paired to make the difference.
Yeah, this is true. Did you want to make a point?
So what I hear you saying, and I think what I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm banish the word scale from my vocabulary, because I think every time we come up with a good idea, our innate instinct is scale it and make a lot of money, right? That's been what's been driving us. Come up with a solution, a green tech solution, whatever kind of solution it is, and how can I make this bigger, faster, so that the whole world can benefit? And I think that always becomes an extractive action. It always ends up in violating the local ecosystem, the local ecology, and the local culture. And so I'm working with a group of people way down East Maine on the Canadian border right now, and these are called Young Agrarians, are part of that movement, and their whole vision is completely different to where it is completely community-based. And let's get to know everyone in the community, including the indigenous community there, and let's just, together, just us, just figure out how we can grow oysters and kelp and grow blueberries and cranberries and dive for scallops and weave baskets and get the alewife fishery back and running, and how we can just barter and make that community work. We can share that information on how we're doing this globally, that the open sourcing of information, so that anyone in the world can figure out, oh, here's how these people are doing it. That's what your job as a journalist is, and writing books, is here's how these people are doing it, and what of this can you apply in your situation? But really, I think we're headed toward a situation where we're just solving problems locally, and that's going to be how it goes. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is worth knowing that a lot of these efforts are going on beneath the radar. So the fact that farmer-managed natural regeneration has been so quiet, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it didn't become an extractive operation. It's been spreading farmer to farmer with support from organizations. You know, Tony is not out there, you know, trying to make a name for himself. He believes, you know, he is in service to the communities that he works with.
I guess I want to hear the stories about the network, the local networks, and why they succeed in some places and why they don't in others, and how can people assist. And then we can apply it to Vermont.
Yeah, there are stories all over. But in terms of the insight, you know, the ecological insight and the transformation, it does involve community work. And I'm thinking of another amazing story. I haven't talked to him in 24 hours, but but let me take you there, okay? And now he's doing extraordinary work elsewhere. But I follow him and really admire what he's doing, and he is speaking out for the importance of working with communities and it not being extractive. So this is a guy named Neil Spackman, who's an American who, for kind of random reasons, ended up studying Arabic in university. He's Mormon. He went to Brigham Young University. He's from Minnesota. So he didn't know what he wanted to do with it, but he ended up translating reports. It was really boring. He started, you know, saying, I don't want to sit at a desk. And he started getting interested in permaculture and natural design. So he's like sort of starting this other life. Then he was, because of his language ability, he was invited to take part in a poverty reduction project in Western Saudi Arabia with Bedouin, the local Bedouin, who, because of many factors, but largely in his view, a change in law about land ownership, okay? So these are people, you don't own land, you move from place to place, but suddenly land was owned, which completely changed their capacity to move with their herds through the seasons, you know, back and forth through the seasons, and they ended up living in concrete, you know, blocks and really being impoverished. And again, because in order to live their lives and keep their herds going, they needed money, so they were chopping down trees, selling it to restaurants in the bigger cities. So this was a disaster. So, all right, so he gets involved in this project, and then he says, I would like to have an ecological component to this project. So he did a fast track permaculture design course in desert permaculture with Jeff Lawton, the fellow who said all the world's problems can be solved in a garden. And they picked a 100-acre site, and Neil gathered a team of Bedouin. He wore clothes that they wore. He honored their way of life, lived among them, and this took years. So what he did was he and his team, they prepared for the rain. So in Western Saudi Arabia, it gets wicked hot, and it may rain once or twice or 0 times a year. But when it does rain, it floods because it's sand. There's nothing to hold the water. So what they did was they worked to slow down the water with very simple earthworks. So what they did was they would prepare these very simple earthworks, and then when it rained, they would rush out and plant. And then
terracing and stuff?
Yeah, terraces, like lots of different kind of flavors of earthwork, like swales that would steer it, and little stone, whatever you call, like, earthworks is what things, to hold the water. So over time, and it started very, they saw results quickly, but to get real results, it took years. So they did this over several years. I think I would say from 2011 to 2016, when the project ran out of funds, so they stopped the irrigation. And with the irrigation, it's really important to know that they only used the water that they collected. So in Neil's words, they never went beyond their water budget. We're dealing with a situation, in the Midwest and the West, where the Ogallala aquifer is about to be, in certain parts, they're running out. So that is not good water budgeting. But they were determined to stay within their water budget. So anyway, they ran out of funds, so they stopped the irrigation, and Neil had to do something else. He ended up getting an executive MBA at Stanford. But his reaction was, well, the permaculture ideal is to create a self-sustaining system, so we didn't choose this, but we get to see whether it worked. So he went away, and then a couple of years later, he came back and filmed the scene. And 80% of the trees that they had planted survived. And this in a time where I think they had 2.5 years without rain. I mean, that is extraordinary, because what had happened is that they had built this mycorrhizal network that sustained those trees and brought moisture that was in the soil to the trees. They had built the soil so that it had the capacity to do that. So that was really quite extraordinary. So Neil goes and he gets his MBA, and he thinks about where could he and with his knowledge have the greatest impact. So he started a company called Regenerative Resources, and they're working in Baja California to rebuild mangrove areas and have regenerative shrimp farms. Shrimp farms, we know it's destroying a lot of wetland, like coastal ecosystems, but this is a regenerative system. So that's what he's working on now, and they're planting a huge number of mangroves. So within the last 24 hours, I will share with you that I got a 10-minute video from the U.S. Geological Survey telling the story of a ranch in southern Arizona. And I tell this, the segue is that they did exactly the same things. They put in, actually, the guy, it's the Austins. So Valere Austin is in her 80s, and I think it was older film. I don't think her husband Josiah is still with us, but there were clips of him saying, I just kept building them, thousands of these earthworks. And a scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey wanted to document what the difference was, because that watershed has been extraordinarily resilient with the long periods of drought. And a nearby one is suffering from what many areas suffer from, that you get rain and there's erosion and it washes all the nutrients away, and then it's dry over long periods of time. So it's what these before and after, or this ranch and that ranch visuals are really striking. So this was so hopeful, because you look at this and you think, this doesn't cost anything. It's very low impact, very low. It can be done. One of the so-called fathers of permaculture is Bill Mollison, and he is famous for saying, as the problems of the world become increasingly complex, the solutions are embarrassingly simple. This is one of those, and someone that I had interviewed, Ramesh Kent, added, and embarrassingly inexpensive. So I saw that, and that has stuck, that particular video, and that stuck with me, because as I was starting to say, the Southwest is suffering hugely. I had a long conversation with actually someone I wrote about in another book, in the book Water in Plain Sight, Hope for a Thirsty World. I had a chapter about a couple that farmed with dew, that in far west Texas, when everybody else was complaining about that there's no water out there, they were getting all their water because they had designed their barn to maximize condensation, so it was flowing into their water tank. Anyway, they are brilliant. We spent several days with them in far west Texas, in the middle of July, Terlingwood, Texas. It's a miserable place.
What did they use? A lot of vines?
No, it was the way they designed the roof.
Oh.
So it's a metal roof, and so what happened was it would really heat up during the day, and then you'd get moist breezes, and the differential between the heat of that, it was held in that metal, and the breeze created condensation. So that's how they got all their water. So anyway, we became friends with them, and they've since moved to New Mexico on a drive across the country. My husband and I stayed with them in New Mexico, and Catherine kept saying, it's really dry. I'm really, really worried. She kept saying we're in a stage 4 drought. In the meantime, they were trying to do all these things. They were preparing for people who need homes. They really had their eye on that. Anyway, you've probably heard about the Hermit's Peak and the Calf Canyon fires in New Mexico, in northeast New Mexico, tore right through their land. They have an adobe, like a 130-year-old adobe house that did not burn, and they know they're very lucky, but Catherine said today that about 800 people live in their little valley, and about 400 of them are unhoused right now. So they're really working on how to rebuild. She works for an organization called the Quivira Coalition, which is all about sustainable, productive southwestern landscapes. But talking to Catherine and seeing this video, just the Southwest can be so much different from what we're dealing with now. And so in some places it might be the earthworks, in other places they're working with beavers, and that is, in Nevada, there's a watershed where they have completely brought back the nature and the water in stark contrast to areas around them by bringing back beavers. Yes?
What happens in Grand Canyon?
Oh, I don't know about.
Came.
That was
Yellowstone.
Oh, you do mean?
That was Yellowstone, yeah.
The one that happened yesterday?
Yeah.
Or Monday?
Or just flooded.
The
Floods.
The flood
Oh,
is
yeah.
Yellowstone.
Yellowstone.
Rainfall.
Yeah, huge rains.
Yeah.
And I don't know what was happening upstream, but we're all connected through our watersheds. And so if someone, if the land is managed in a way that allows the water to slow down. No, I'm not blaming anyone because I don't know about that particular, but we are all connected. I really don't know about that particular scenario.
pictures of it on TV, and it was
Yeah.
devastating.
Yeah, and then do you know anything more about
Well, I
that?
saw videos of that huge house just
Yes.
Yeah.
going into the river and washing away. So I mean, they're building on a floodplain, right? So that's number one mistake. Don't build on a floodplain.
But it looked like the roads and everything were gone.
Yeah, I mean, you've got those big floods that come through every,
Yes.
it used to be 500 years, now it happens every couple of weeks.
Wow.
Yeah,
It reminded me of Hurricane Irene because
Sure.
the way that road looked was just like Route 4 going from
Yeah.
Rutland to Killington. I mean, it was just missing in vast numbers of places.
yeah, and water, builds in velocity as it moves. Yeah, no, it's real, and we don't have agency about what does or doesn't come down from the sky, although people would argue with that, and we could have a longer conversation about that. How rain is created and driven by vegetation.
Or lack thereof.
Yeah. No, there's a paper I love by an Australian scientist. Clouds prefer native vegetation. That kind of tells you. But the water is always cycling, and when water cycles, it allows for a more functional water cycle.
And I often think of, I keep all these books that I have read, and I can't remember whose book it is in. Sometimes it's a conflict between practices, like in cattle ranching. I think it was in Tony Hiss's book, Rescuing the Planet. He
I don't know
describes
that.
a situation where, because they're letting the cattle just roam wherever they want, they're eating everything.
Right, that's called continuous grazing.
And so there was some mediator that they called in because there was an argument, like people were like actually sabotaging people's water supplies and stuff because there was an argument between people who thought it shouldn't be like that and others who thought, and the people who were doing the continuous grazing.
So I wrote about something similar.
Well, maybe it was you.
Yeah, in New Mexico. Was that it?
Okay, and the mediator came in?
Yes.
She reads your books and remembers them.
Cool. Yay. No, that's great. Yeah. No, that was
I mean,
crazy.
it's just like there's just conflicts of what people think is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
They've done the grazing that way for so long.
Right.
and
Right.
They have the rights to do it.
Right.
Wherever they want. And so they think that's like the only way to do it.
So I'm going to tell you a mini story from that mediator, and then I can share how I got there, how I ended up in the Wild West with Jeff. This guy, Jeff Goble, who does mediation work, has a consensus approach. So he told me of one story when it was a bunch of ranchers in Montana, and the land was horrible, and the ranchers were extremely unhappy because their children didn't want to go, they were losing money, and their children didn't want to go into ranching, and they were distraught because this has been generation after generation, but they felt helpless. They were concerned that the land that had been in their families would just, go be sold off. And so he did a consensus workshop, and through that, people were expressing their fears, and they were talking about different kinds of cattle management called holistic planned grazing, that there was reason to believe that would solve their problems of not earning any money, that they would do much better, and they all knew about that. But what was getting in the way is that each rancher was concerned about what his or her, I think they were mostly men, what their neighbors would think. Because I've talked to a lot of people, kind of pioneers in holistic cattle management. Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people who said they couldn't, if they walked into the local cafe, everybody would stop talking and sort of go like this. So, so that was real. But here, these people were afraid of what their neighbors would think, and their neighbors were sitting next to them, and their neighbors were afraid of what they would think. So they realized, oh, no. We can do this. And they've changed, and I think that the situation has changed dramatically. That was up in Montana. But yeah, so this consensus method, so actually, I think it was what you said. You said that knowledge itself doesn't change anything. So, yeah, so.
Well, I would add to that so much with farmers is spread from farmer to farmer. That's the best way to do it, to see what someone else has done and to be able to talk to them. Sometimes it doesn't work. But I'm reminded of one YouTube episode on regenerative cattle ranching, and it was in the American West, and the usual problems of drought and so on, and year after year this big ranch was doing worse and worse as far as the expense of raising whatever they managed to raise. It was the wife who said, no more of this, all right? And she called the family together to do an intervention with her husband, who was the main rancher.
Yeah.
And so it showed him very happily now, rotating his grazing, riding around, not on a horse, but, one of the little all-terrain vehicles. So.
Yeah, Alan Savory would say that he would always ask, when he would go and do a site visit, who writes the checks? And that's the person he wanted to talk to. And he said that men that he works with, he said that men are incredibly resistant to writing a plan. They'd rather do anything else. They'd rather fail 1,000,000 times than actually sit down and write a plan. So often he works with the women. Yeah, it is really interesting. Yeah, so anyway, as a journalist, my relationship to the world was always that, well, people just need the right information, and that's what I'll do. I'll just, I'll just tell stories of better ways, and then people will respond because that would be logical, and that's all I have to do. And then at one point, I'm sitting in a conference, this is in Mexico, with all these people, I've heard them speak before, And, you know, they're saying the same things, and I'm just kind of listening and or stopped listening and just, you know what, this isn't getting anywhere. And then it hit me that it's not just about knowledge, it's not just about information. So as it turned out, this fellow Jeff Goble was at this conference, and I had heard about his work. There's a guy named Peter Donovan that I wrote about, and then became really good friends with, in part because of the crazy coincidence that his father and my parents lived in the same retirement community in upstate New York. I mean, so it was incredible. So, you know, I'd go visit my parents, and then Peter and I, he's brilliant. We would walk around a nearby nature reserve and talk about the carbon cycle. And I'd always learn so much from him because his mind is just way beyond most of us. But anyway, he's a very big proponent of this consensus method, and he was telling me about it. It's really great. People sit around in a circle and you listen to each other, and I was thinking, no, I'm too impatient. I don't have time for that. I just want to get the stories. I just want to get the word out. But so I'm sitting here at this conference, and oh, you know what? This isn't working. Let me find out what this other thing is. So talked to Jeff. We did a kind of miniature workshop where I got a sense of some of the dynamics and kind of how sitting in a circle and how you can build trust quickly, and what it is like to listen to others and to actually feel that people are listening to you. And so I got a flavor of it. And then he said, well, I'm doing a workshop in New Mexico. That's where he lives. And why don't you come down and see what it's like? So great. So I, you know, bought a ticket and all this, and then, oops, got a phone call. Well, all the ranchers are in court this week, so we have to reschedule. So it turns out that they were all suing each other and suing themselves. I've never figured that out. But so there was all this, there was all this going on. So the story is that it's actually a ghost town. It's called Cabazon. It's a ghost town in rural New Mexico. The land is awful. It's Bureau of Land Management land. There are families that have been there for centuries from Spain, and they've been cattle ranching for a long time and doing continuous grazing, which means just putting the animal out there, which is a sure way to ensure that you get overgrazing, you know, that the land, you're not getting a balance of animal impact evenly. So they're all doing horribly. They have water. They have access to, they have on the land an aquifer, so there's a pump house, and there are people who live in town, and the people who live in town get water from the pump house, but so who's managing the pump house became a thing. And there was sabotage, and it came to blows, it came to gunfire. People were afraid to bring their children to the land because they were afraid of their neighbors. They were afraid of the people who they grew up with. And the fighting was so constant that the Bureau of Land Management just was giving up. Just, we can't deal with these people anymore, because they kept having to go and deal with the conflict. And I just remember that at there was law enforcement there at the workshop, because apparently the last time that this group got together, people were throwing chairs. So we did this. So Jeff organized this workshop, and over 3 days, I watched this community go from that state of being, conflict and suspicion, to committing to rebuild relationships and restore the land. And in the 3-day workshop, it wasn't even until the very end that the land was even brought into the conversation. And the amazing thing is that since then, since I finished the book, it has gone even further. Jeff told me, so I'm working with him a lot. I mentioned to Sue that I am living in this book right now. I can explain that in a minute. But Jeff said that the son of one of the ranchers, who actually I thought was one of the most difficult people to reach, this guy, he started learning, getting curious about holistic planned grazing, had a workshop on his land about holistic planned grazing, and started to bring other people in to train in it. Now his son is in college studying land management and specializing in that.
Yeah.
So it's gone to another generation. So Jeff just chuckles like, yep, you know, this is how it goes.
That's when the knowledge helps.
Yeah, so it really transformed. And I can say, as a certifiable impatient person, that during those 3 days, I was just like, oh my gosh, this is, you know, do we need to have this conversation about what is a facilitator? What does it mean to record, you know, just, but.
How big are these ranches?
They had allotments, I don't know. But these particular ranches, I don't know. But I've been to
They're
lots
for-
of different,
For cattle, to feed people.
yeah,
It's a whole other thing.
yeah. But I have been to ranches where they have restored the land dramatically. Lots of those places. So anyway, during it, it can feel tedious, but the transformation really has held. I mean, it was amazing. And so a lot of people have been coming to Jeff, can you teach me, how do I train to do this? Including people who read my book have approached him. So he decided during this Zoom era, since there were so few things that he could do in person, because a workshop in person can be very powerful, but while you miss that dynamic, you can also have people from all over. So he put together a consensus institute with people in Australia. I mean, this is just how it played out. A number of people in New England, including a really good friend of mine who's always sort of been intrigued by what I do, but this is where she found it. So people in New England and a lot of people from the Pacific Northwest are doing this consensus institute. So it's like 3 weekend workshops, but it's divided, so it's 4 hours over 2 days over consecutive weekends. It's a little clunky that way, but there are about 18 of us who have really seen it through, and we have seen extraordinary changes in people, and different people are applying it in different ways. And one woman is bringing it to the Portland, Oregon Police Department. For bureaucratic reasons, it's stalled a little bit, but she's really gotten it to the point where they're going to do this. Another woman in Australia, that this football, soccer club is sort of taking over a reserve, a nature reserve park, and she's got the community coming together, and now after a period where the big power players didn't want to deal with it because they thought that they could just ignore the community, now they're coming to the table. So people are using this in different ways, but even on an individual level, it's been really amazing. So,
We need
yeah.
you in Cambridge for the Indian mascot fish.
Okay.
In Rutland.
We made national
For
news,
what?
Really?
and it has ripped our community.
I didn't know that was still going on.
It will, it's ripped our community asunder.
We're talking about names?
Mm-hmm.
Raiders. Yeah, Lord.
Yeah.
when we had the whole mediation thing, the whole last winter, we had hired mediators come in at community meetings where we were sitting together. I sat between two co-guys, and I've known them for 30 years. And we did reach a point where they'll say hi to me again.
Okay.
Because the one guy shows up at my next door neighbor's like 3 times a week and just like I didn't exist. And after that mediation, he came and talked to me for 45 minutes. And so it does make a difference to be in the same room together and to, you can do so much on social media just lashing out
Yeah.
and invectives. And when you are forced to sit in a group for 2 hours together, you have to come to some respect for that.
So there's that level, and then the series of questions that people answer is specifically designed to build trust. And actually, he learned this from his mentor, someone named Bob Chadwick. It's not common ground, it's new ground. Because often we think that it's like, well, it's yes over here, it's no over here. But often where the answer is somewhere over there. Sorry.
Is anybody applying this to our U.S. Senate?
Not that I know of, but there's a very good chance. So now I'm part of this kind of little facilitation group, me and Jeff, and then 2 people in Australia. And it kind of feels like we're this, so I'm applying this with an organization that's just sort of gotten underway called the Eco Restoration Alliance. So it's the kind of thing where a few people said, we know this is what the group is, but like we're in a hurry, everything is urgent, and let's write a mission statement right now. But then I thought, from what I've been learning about consensus, well, wait a second. We have scientists, we have people from all over the world. If we just kind of, pin it down, because it's easy, we are missing the input. We are missing the collective wisdom of the group. And so, and I knew that was ticking people off because they didn't feel listened to. So we're in the middle of this process. We did 1 workshop, and we're doing another one in 2 weeks. Yeah. Oh, I was going to say the U.S. Senate. They haven't. No one's called. No one's called our little team. However, guns.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So there is an emergency room doctor in Bennington who takes a public health view of gun violence and really focuses on how to minimize injury, and wants to have, he is a gun owner, he trains youth in 4-H and all of this, but my husband and I just talked to him at a party, and he did say that, anyway, he was hitting some walls, so we may do some work with that. Because, as you hear his stories from the ER, you see how to build capacity to slow and possibly stop the damage. So we might do this. My colleague in Australia is very excited about this. Just thinking about my friends dealing with the fires, and another colleague when I went to cowgirl camp, and they in the Pacific Northwest, and they had just had fires, and how she was curious about how the land would respond. I just want to say that there is so much courage out there. Catherine and Marcus and the challenges they have, they're on the land. They're supporting their community, they're working with their community, and yeah, there's just a lot of courage out there, and I'm really, really, that really inspires me, and you know, and humbles me a lot. So, anyway, thank you all.